Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this episode are that of the guest and host and do not necessarily reflect the values of sponsors or other associated organizations. Welcome to the Parental Compass by Family Education and Support Services. I am your host, Bobby Williams. As always, I want you to please subscribe to the show and leave us a review. It makes a big difference to us. Trauma can show up in many forms for young people. It could be neglect, divorce, the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's something quieter, everyday experiences like getting bullied. No matter the source, one thing remains true. Healing begins with connection. So, how we build relationships with youth can help them to feel seen, supported, and safe, especially during times of grief and trauma. Today, we are joined by Beth Tyson, a mother, therapist, and parenting educator. She's also author of the children's books, A Grand Family for Sullivan and Sullivan Goes to See Mama. You can learn more about Beth's work by going to bethtyson.com. Let's meet Beth.
Sure. Yeah. So children need not only physical safety from their caregivers, but they also need emotional safety because you can be physically safe, right? But not feel emotionally safe to express yourself or that you feel supported in your feelings and emotions. So it's important that caregivers focus on that aspect of safety just as much as physical safety. And what emotionally safe looks like is a child whose emotions are accepted. Having caregivers who are able to be present with a child when they're in distress, allow them to feel what they're feeling, and validate their emotions in the child. So if a child is very upset about something, instead of ignoring them or trying to dis devalue their feelings by saying, "Oh, stop crying, there's nothing to cry about, what's wrong with you, stop acting like a baby." All of that can seem very natural and normal if parents have heard that in their own upbringing, but we've learned over time and through research that what children really need is not to be shamed for their emotions, but to have the caregivers around them be accepting of their emotions, which allows that emotional safety to develop between the parent and the child or the caregiver.
Being validating seems so important too, of just you're not wrong for feeling the way you feel. So, what does it look like to be validating? How can you talk with your child in a way that makes them feel valid?
Yeah, sure. So I actually created a model. It's called the GRACE model, and each letter stands for something different. And I won't go into the whole thing because it would be a separate podcast probably. But basically, it gives you a step-by-step protocol of like how you can respond when a child comes to you with some big feelings. And the first thing that we need to do is really ground ourselves, because if we're not aware of what's coming up in us, then we tend to get triggered, right? So children can really bring out strong emotions in us, especially if they're demanding attention or demanding to be seen in a way that we weren't seen or heard as a child. And when that happens, it can make it really difficult for the adult to stay present with the child. So the first thing we want to do is ground ourselves, and whether that's taking a couple of breaths, whether that's feeling your feet on the floor and feeling supported by the ground beneath you, just some things to get grounded in your own body before interacting with the child. And it could just be a couple of seconds, maybe even splashing some cold water on your face if you need, just kind of get in your body. And lots of different tips and tools for that, which is really mindfulness, just like being aware of what you're feeling and where you are. And recognizing too, like, that this is not about the child being bad or the child being manipulative or trying to hurt you, that children are always doing the best that they can. So I use a mantra when I'm feeling frustrated in my own family, which is my child's a good kid having a hard time. I'm a good parent having a hard time. So that, there's some recognition that we are not our behaviors. And I think I got that from Dr. Becky, and I may have changed it a little bit, but she's like a parenting influencer right now that many people may have heard of. And I love her work. But basically it's reminding ourselves that behavior is communication, and it's not necessarily a personal attack on the caregiver. And when we can get underneath what the behavior is trying to tell us, we are more likely to meet the child with some empathy and compassion instead of frustration and impatience and shame.
It seems so easy to just fall back into old habits, though, or you think of the way you were raised, and that's kind of your default sometimes. And making that shift can be difficult.
Oh, trust me, you will not get it right. I don't get it right all the time. We will mess up, we will make mistakes, but the most important thing is that we go back and repair those mistakes and those mishaps with our kids. And this isn't something a lot of previous generations knew how to do or knew that it was even okay to do. It was kind of like, you apologize to your kid. What? No, that will make them think I'm not in control, or I'm wrong, and they'll just walk all over me. And really what we see is that parents are human as much as our children are, and we never are going to get it right 100% of the time. And so the important thing is when we do make mistakes, we do lose our cool, we don't respond exactly in the most emotionally intelligent way, that we go back and say, hey, once things have calmed down, go back to the child and say, I'm really not happy with the way I responded to you earlier. I messed up, and I'm sorry. And and allowing them to share how it made them feel, and say, what was it like to see mommy so angry? Or, that must have really scared you, and I'm sorry. So just to, again, to repair the relationship is just as important, if not more so, than um, than getting it right all the time. We're never going to get it right all the time.
For context, I worked with a lot of youth who were in foster care who had bounced between several different placements. And sometimes when they go through trauma, they are just wiling out. They're having some very big, very difficult behaviors. And so, how do you handle that where instead of just correction, it's connection? Because you have to have some kind of boundaries or safeguards, but then you still want them to stay connected and not alienated from you.
Right. So you just hit on something really big. It's that connection comes before the correction. So we want to maintain the connection, with a child, and then try and correct the behavior, because without the connection, the correction won't really be effective. And especially for children in foster care or adoptive or kinship homes, their trust is already broken from the day they walk in the door, right? Because they've already been separated from their biological family for some reason. And so we already know that they've experienced a trauma at that point. So their ability to trust themselves and to trust others and the world around them has already been damaged. And so we're going to have to do extra work as the adults to rebuild that sense of trust in the child. And some of the ways we do that is, and what we find is that when we do, work on the trust, we start to see the behaviors start to settle down. They're wiling out and going nuts because they feel so incredibly unsafe, and they don't know how to express it. And so they cover it up with anger a lot of times, because anger is a secondary emotion. And it's easier to be angry than to say I'm scared, especially for a teen or, an older kid who may have a tough persona, or like a tough exterior. And so they will typically go to anger or shutting down, instead of being able to express that they're feeling fearful. So we really want to focus on building that trust. But in certain moments, of course, there are going to be those times where, the behavior is shocking and you don't know what to do. And so sometimes we have to have safety plans in place. And so I always recommend that caregivers have a second person they can reach out to. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's an aunt nearby, or a friend, or somebody that they can call in an emergency that can step in and help out, and is trauma informed and understands that the child's behavior. And then of course, in like with young children, or families where there might be some physical like hitting and stuff from young children, because when they get really angry they can sometimes hit or bite. I always recommend having pillows in every room of the house nearby, so that if you're in a moment and something does happen, you can at least protect yourself with a pillow and kind of have a little bit of a barrier, because sometimes it does get really intense. And the reason it gets that intense is, again, not because these are bad, quote unquote, kids, but because these are children who have been through an enormous amount of pain and suffering, and they have valid rage in their bodies based off of what they've experienced. And when they start to feel safe and they start to feel like they can trust somebody, some of that valid rage is going to come out towards the caregiver, because they are starting to feel as though they can let some of it out. And oftentimes caregivers at that point are like, this kid hates me, I'm scared of this child, he or she hates me, and is being aggressive, yelling at me, whatever it might be. But really what that is a sign that the child is starting to feel as though he or she can let out some of that rage. And it's valid experience as a human to feel rage when you've been wronged in so many ways.
It's validating for me to hear you say that, because what I would talk with parents about is like, oh, that's good. They trust you. And, I know that's true, but it's good to hear it's not just a line I was feeding
No.
uh, to make them feel better, because it is really challenging. And so you talk about ambiguous loss, and that's
Mhm.
not necessarily always someone that died. That can be someone that's alive that they're grieving. Can you tell me a little more about ambiguous loss?
Yeah, so ambiguous loss is the theme behind my two children's books. One is called A Grand Family for Sullivan, which is a story about a child who suddenly has to live with his grandmother due to safety issues with his parents. And it walks through the child through like what it's like to suddenly have your world turn upside down, and experiencing lots of losses that are not necessarily deaths. So ambiguous loss is, there's two types. There is type one, which is when the person is physically absent but emotionally present. So that might be a situation where a child's parent is not in their everyday life, like foster care, but is still very much emotionally present in the child's inner world. And so that child is missing and longing for that parent, but they are not able to be in everyday relationship for either safety reasons or other maybe mental health problems or substance misuse. So that's a type of grief a child is going through that often does not get acknowledged, and they don't have language for, and there's no rituals for it, and it can be incredibly painful. It's actually one of the most traumatic types of loss, is when the person is still out there but you just can't be with them, and you're not sure when you'll see them again. So there's no closure, and there's just lots of wondering and tension around, is this person in my life or are they not? And that constant tension is what creates a lot of the behaviors that we're seeing, because there's no place for their mind to rest. They're kind of always mulling over, these big issues about, will I see my parents again? What might happen to them? Are they safe? Are they okay? Are they alive? There's lots of question marks, and that is not something our brains like very much. Our brains like certainty, and they like closure, and we like to compartmentalize things. And in ambiguous loss, you just really can't compartmentalize the experience. and there's no answers. And then the other type of ambiguous loss is when the person is physically present but emotionally unavailable. So this might be a child who's living with a parent who's still in like active substance use. So physically the parent is still in their everyday life, but mentally and emotionally the parent is not available because they are struggling so much with their own mental health, their own trauma, and their own substance use to cope with the trauma, that they're end up emotionally neglecting their children, and then the child is experiencing a major loss, again with no words for it, no closure, no certainty, no ability to bridge that gap. So those are the two examples. And so I share a lot about how do we help children through that, how do we help them cope with uncertainty and grief and loss, even when it doesn't involve an actual death.
That's interesting. I feel like neglect is just one of the most traumatizing things. Like sometimes it seems like even more than physical abuse, neglect really hits hard. And, not to discredit physical abuse. So you have a young person, they're looking for answers. How can you talk with them about these things and maybe give them a little more certainty? Or I guess situations aren't always certain, but is there a way to get this conversation going with them?
Yeah. So the first thing is to help them acknowledge their losses. So children will only acknowledge loss that we acknowledge, really, because they don't know they even have permission to feel sad or grief, or they don't even have the language to say I've experienced a loss, because our culture does not recognize these types of losses. We only recognize pretty much illnesses and death and things like that, but we don't have any cultural or social rituals for this, at least in my experience. And so giving them the language and saying, this, you have had lots of losses, like let's talk about the things that you've lost, um, and helping them understand that maybe some of what they're experiencing is grief, but then also the uncertainty and how hard that is to hold all at once. And then noticing also to what they've gained. So even though we've had all these losses, there's always things that are gained as well. So maybe they gained safety, maybe they gained a new connection with a caregiver or a family member that they weren't in touch with before. Maybe they made a new friend at their new school after they moved to grandma's. There's things that have been gained too, sometimes, not always, but we don't want to jump right to that. We want to focus first on acknowledging the losses, and helping them grieve. And you can do that with rituals and with things that are not necessarily ending the relationship. So we don't have to end our emotional relationship with somebody just because the physical relationship has ended. So even if you can't see your parent, or your sibling or whoever it may be, you can still stay connected to them in other safe ways. So maybe you help the child stay connected by getting one of mom's recipes and making their favorite lasagna or their favorite chicken dish or something. And that's a way you are staying connected in a safe way. Making sure the children have that, those threads sort of back to their biological family is so valuable for their self-worth, even if the parent is not safe enough to be in their everyday life. So getting creative. For one child, there was this client, or not a client, a colleague of mine, who's had a teen, or I think she was more of a preteen client, who didn't have any real identifying information about who her parents were, for all kinds of reasons. And what the social worker was able to find was the address of the hospital where she was born. And so the social worker took her to that hospital, and she was able to see, where she came from, in terms of, at least she can say, I know where I was born. And that information, it gives me chills every time I retell this story. But even very, things that we might think of as insignificant, if you haven't had all this type of loss, that was so grounding for her to be able to at least say, I know I was where I was born, and to walk within those walls. Um, was a very helpful and healing experience for her, and gave her some self value and identity to hold on to. So that's what I mean by helping them name it, but then also helping them stay connected in safe ways if they can't have a physical, like, relational experience with the person who's missing.
Beth Tyson, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me here this morning. We're always just kind of skimming the surface, but I think we had some good pieces of advice and things to think about for parents. Do you have any ideas or thoughts you want to leave us with?
I really, I think the hardest work that we have to do is within ourselves for children. We often focus on what do we need to help the child with, what do we need to quote unquote fix to make the child, behave the way we want them to. But I encourage caregivers, adults, and anyone who works with children, just to remember that children can bring out our own, um, can uncover our own wounds and our own stuff. And we really also need to be looking inside at what do we need to work on for ourselves to show up in our best way possible for children, so that we're not passing down unhealthy patterns and behaviors to our children and to the kids that we work with. So that's my reminder to, don't just focus on the child's behavior, but what it's bringing up in you.
Hmm. It's always never easy, you know?
Mm-mm. No, this is hard work, but in the end, it is worth it. And, you may not see the fruits of your labor, especially if you're working with children in these situations. But you are planting the seeds, and it's important to keep the hope going, because I can imagine it can feel very hopeless for a lot of people. But the research does show that it only takes one caring, compassionate, loving adult in a child's life to mitigate a lot of the impacts of trauma. And so I also encourage you to be that one safe, loving adult.
A great point to end on. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again, Beth. BethTyson.com, a grand family for Sullivan. Sullivan Goes to See Mama, available on Amazon. I'm Bobby Williams. This has been The Parental Compass. We'll see you next episode. Peace.